Hey everyone, welcome back to Here in Apologetics. I'm so pumped you're joining us today to have Dr. Robert Larmer on the podcast. He's a professor of philosophy at the University of New Brunswick up in Canada. And today we're going to be talking about methodological naturalism and miracles. So Robert, thank you so much for joining me. How are you doing today?
I'm quite well. Thank you.
That's good. I'm super excited for today. I just want to say, as always, with this podcast is brought to you guys. So if you value what we do, you can support it at patreon.com. So Here in Apologetics. You can support for as little as $1 a month, and that'd be huge. But Robert, it's your first time on the show. Do you want to talk a little bit about like who you are and what you do, and just kind of like introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm a philosophy professor at the University of New Brunswick. I came there it's too long ago. I came there in 1986, and I've been there since then. I'm currently chair of the department. We're a small department, so we teach in a lot of different areas, but my areas of kind of specialty have been in philosophy of religion. I've written extensively on the topic of miracle with several books on miracle. And I've also written quite a bit on the intelligent design movement and questions around philosophy of science. And I've done a little bit of publishing in applied ethics, especially business ethics. Yeah.
That's super cool. To get things started, Robert, do you want to talk a little bit about like what is this idea of methodological naturalism?
Well, methodological naturalism, the term was first used by a philosopher called Edgar Brightman in a 1937 article. But then the term was kind of reinvented by a Christian philosopher at Wheaton, Paul de Vries. I don't think he knew of Brightman. But what he suggested in coming to terms with the relation between religious belief and scientific investigation is that people should adopt what he called methodological naturalism. So methodological naturalism claims to be metaphysically neutral. You're not saying that you are a naturalist. You're not saying as a matter of fact that you believe in naturalism. But for the pursuit of science, what de Vries recommended was that you act as if you are a naturalist. That is to say, you presume that for anything that happens in the physical world, there is a natural cause. So what he was recommending is that scientists should recommend as their prescribed method that any event they investigate, they posit that there must be a natural cause, so that as a scientist, you could never posit a non-natural cause for an event. So, for example, if you were talking about the origin of life, you could never invoke a design explanation. You would have to look for an explanation in terms of purely natural, non-teleological causes. And I presume that if in the case of, say, a miracle, say somebody recovering very quickly from what was thought to be a terminal disease, say they recover very, very quickly, that you would never attribute that to some kind of supernatural cause. You would attribute that to some kind of natural cause, even if we don't know what that cause is.
Okay. So when we're thinking about like methodological naturalism, what we're trying to do here for someone that like ascribes to this view is that when we're answering questions about the world, like why did life arise, or how did this person's cancer go away, or things like that, the tools that they're going to use are tools that are devoid of like supernatural agency. And they're really going to look to explain things like within like the laws of nature, or like whatever like the fundamental like forces of like the natural world are. And that's kind of where it ends under this picture. Is that right?
That would be exactly right. So suppose you're praying and you feel that, say, an inner voice spoke to you, and you are thinking about how that should be explained. That would need to be explained in terms of purely natural causes rather than saying somehow it was directly, say, a supernatural being speaking to you. Or if you were to take, well, this would be an extreme example, but suppose we admit or say that Jesus died and in 3 days was alive again. If you were a thoroughgoing methodological naturalist, you would have to say that the only causes that we can posit for that would be purely natural ones. You'd have to say, we don't know how this happened, but however it happened, there's a purely natural explanation.
Okay. So what I'd like to do is I want to, in a minute, get into like some of the objections you've brought forward to like this view. But first, I just want to like paint a picture of like, why would someone hold to this view? Like, why would people like be methodological naturalists?
That's a very good question. And here, just in case your listeners are wanting to do some further investigation, there's an open access article I wrote called The Many Inadequate Justifications of Methodological Naturalism. And in that article, I go through the various reasons people have given to accept methodological naturalism, and I critique them. I'll say something just briefly here. I think the best, most promising justification of methodological naturalism would be an inductive argument saying, well, science has been very, very successful in explaining things in terms of natural causes. So when we find an event that we don't yet have an explanation in terms of natural causes, our past experience suggests that we will have one. Now, here in a response, I think what we need to do is make a distinction between what is sometimes known as nomenological science and historical science. Nomenological science has to do with events that are regularly repeated. So, for example, I live near the Bay of Fundy, and the tides come in and go out on a regular basis. And nobody would be inclined to say that that's somehow God directly doing it. We would talk about that in terms of natural causes. Now, as a theist, I think that natural causes are secondary causes in the sense that their existence is continually maintained by God, but God doesn't directly, as it were, stick in his finger and move the water back and forth. So God causes the tides indirectly through the operation of secondary natural causes. So for lots of science, explanation in terms of God indirectly using secondary natural causes works well, things like the tides. But when we come to historical events that are not regularly repeating, that's not so clear. So for example, I once asked a biologist for a law of biology, and the biologist said, well, you know, life always comes from life. In our experience, living things don't just spontaneously arise. Okay? But we know that life had a beginning. We know that at one time there was not life, and then there was life. Excuse me, I don't know, my screen went blank there for a moment.
I don't know, you're good. I can hear and see you fine, so you're good to keep
going. So when we come to explain things that aren't regular in the sense of being law governed, it's not so clear that the inductive argument actually goes in the direction that we should always posit a natural cause. Because if we say that science could conceivably undermine a supernatural explanation, show that it could be caused in terms of natural rather than supernatural causes, then logically it could also go the other way. So let me give two examples here. when we come to look at the origin of life, we find that it gets harder and harder rather than easier and easier, because we have come to realize just how complex and sophisticated life is. So in Darwin's time, people knew about the existence of the cell, but it was just a black box and they thought it was very simple. What we know now is that the cell is full of nanomachines. In fact, people have described it as a factory. And some of your listeners may have follow Dr. Tour, James Tour, who has been investigating the origin of life. He's one of the top synthetic chemists in the world. And he makes the point that the goalposts are getting further and further away. It's gotten harder and harder to offer a naturalistic explanation of the origin of life, the more we know about it. My second example, suppose that Jesus actually did die and 3 days later is alive again. Suppose that event happened. Well, 2,000 years ago, we knew a lot less about human physiology than we do now. Okay. Now, the increase in knowledge we have of human physiology has not made it easier to give a natural explanation of how that could happen. Rather, it's made it harder. So for events called miracles, and here we need to distinguish two questions. We need to distinguish the question of, did the event occur, from the question of what's its explanation. Okay? Now, supposing that certain events historically regarded as miracles, that those events actually occurred, we can ask the question whether it's the progress of science had made it easier to give those a natural explanation or harder. So suppose at a spoken word, Jesus turned water into wine. Or suppose we have the resurrection. Well, we know a lot more about the chemistry of wine than we did 2,000 years ago. That increased knowledge has made it harder rather than easier to explain how water could instantly turn into wine upon somebody commanding it. Similarly, we know vastly more about human physiology. That has not made it easier, but harder to explain how somebody, after being 3 days dead, could come to life again. Okay, so in the case of events traditionally viewed as miracles, the advance of science has actually made it harder rather than easier to give a natural explanation. Now, this goes back to, I said, the most promising justification of accepting methodological naturalism is the success that science has had in explaining things in natural terms. Okay, well, that's true for a certain set of events, things like tides, certain diseases. But for things like the origin of life or the events traditionally viewed by Christians as miracles, the advance of science actually goes the other way. It makes it harder, less likely that there's a natural explanation. The more we know, the less easy it is to suppose there could be a natural explanation. Okay.
Yeah, that's very helpful. One distinction that you brought up that I think is super helpful for like thinking about like methodological naturalism and like its value or lack thereof is like you brought up the idea of like we should really like this is a really good tool when we're looking at regular events, like say like the tides coming in and out. But when you get to non-regular events, like you brought up, say like the origin of life and stuff like that, that's when things get a little bit more tricky because we don't have like this repeated experience that we can like rely on to help like understand like the phenomena and whatnot.
In fact, we have the repeated experience that life does not just arise spontaneously.
Yeah.
So if I run over a rabbit on the road, just leaving it there there's enough energy to rebuild it, but it's not going to get rebuilt. And
Mm-hmm.
simply having a lot of time doesn't make it easier, because the rabbit just decomposes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
For sure. So what I'd love to do now is kind of look at some of these objections that you've brought towards like methodological naturalism. And the first one is like the truth-seeking objections. Like, what is this objection to methodological naturalism?
Yeah, the objection here is that suppose there are actual events that are caused by the direct action of a supernatural agent. So suppose that miracles do happen, miracles in the sense of divine intervention to bring about an event that nature would not otherwise produce. Okay. Now, if you're a methodological naturalist and you've accepted that it's never legitimate to posit a non-natural cause as the explanation of an event, then even if such events occur, you're always going to be stuck positing a natural explanation, or saying there is a natural explanation, we just don't know it.
Mm-hmm.
So accepting methodological naturalism guarantees that if miracles happen, they can't be recognized as miracles. So it guarantees, say, that even if God intervened in the production of life, in the origin of life, or the development of life, even if God directly intervened to bring those events about, that those events could never be recognized as instances of supernatural causation. So instead of being open to the possibility of some kind of non-natural cause, your method guarantees that even if such causes operate, they can't ever be recognized. And that's known as the truth-seeking objection. In some ways, it could also be thought of as begging the question. That is to say, you're making the assumption that any event that occurs in the world always has a natural cause. And what is the justification of making that assumption? The other thing that I would say here is, I think you can do all the work that methodological naturalism is supposed to do without having to buy methodological naturalism. I mentioned the example earlier of the tides. I don't need to be a methodological naturalist to posit a natural explanation for tides.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting is that methodological naturalism only ever seems to be invoked when people want to rule out something as unscientific. So typically scientists don't use it when they're just doing, their ordinary bench science. They use it when they say, well, we don't want to take intelligent design seriously, or we don't want to be open to the possibility of the miraculous. So methodological naturalism seems to be an attempt to demarcate science from non-science. And that attempt has been notoriously unsuccessful. Philosophers talk about the failure of the demarcation problem. We often use the term scientific or non-scientific in a very pejorative sense. If something is scientific, we think it's right. If we say it's unscientific, we think it's questionable. So if we're using methodological naturalism to say that the only kind of scientific explanation is an explanation in terms of natural causes, then that is a nice rhetorical tool to just dismiss somebody's saying, well, I want to take seriously the idea of divine causes.
Okay, that's helpful. And I cut out for it I literally just lost power. But then I'm connected to my phone for the now. It's the end of what you said there. But I think it's helpful here, like just thinking about this. We're looking at methodological naturalism. What's happening here is, I guess what I'm trying to think about is like you brought up a good example of like you can explain everything the naturalist wants to explain in a lot of senses without being a methodological naturalist. You can explain the tides and things like that. And when you get to more like tricky questions like the origin of life, it seems like I said, like that view just kind of rules out any sort of like explanation, like before even like looking at the question. Because if you're a methodological naturalist, there's no way you could ever confirm or like point to like, there being like really strong evidence that like there is some sort of like agency beyond the natural world. If that's the case, it's probably not a view that you'd want to ascribe to.
That's my criticism. That's one of the criticisms. We mentioned earlier the truth-seeking objection. That is to say, it rules out recognizing if supernatural causes exist. It rules out ever recognizing them. So what methodological naturalism does is it puts a straitjacket on you in that instead of saying, well, I'm after whatever is in fact the case, you're saying, well, I'm after whatever natural explanation I can give of something, whether or not it's the correct explanation.
So let's get another objection, Robert. This is the idea of like, how does methodological naturalism undercut one of the main justifications that people use for metaphysical naturalism?
Yeah. And here, if people want to look at this further, a good author to check out would be Stephen Dilley. I forget the exact title, but in a journal, Philosophy of Christie, some years back, he wrote an article why a philosophical naturalist, that is to say a metaphysical naturalist, shouldn't adopt methodological naturalism. And the argument goes something like this. If you ask somebody who is an atheist, a naturalist, to give a justification of their position, they tend to give two big objections to supernaturalism, to theism. The first is based on Occam's razor. They say, well, there is no evidence for a supernatural cause. And Occam's razor says, don't multiply entities or keep it simple, stupid. If a simple hypothesis will do the work, then don't make a more complicated hypothesis. So one great justification of ontological or metaphysical naturalism is they say, well, there's no evidence of supernatural causation. Well, the problem then is if you're a methodological naturalist, you've adopted a method that guarantees you can never recognize supernatural causes, even if they operate. So the metaphysical naturalist, the philosophical naturalist, says, well, I'm justified in rejecting belief in God because there's no evidence for God. But they've adopted, if they adopt methodological naturalism, they've adopted a method that guarantees they could never have that evidence, even if it exists. Is that making some kind of sense to you? Now, the second, we're having trouble with, I'm not hearing very well, Zach.
Yeah, the problem wasn't you. I was on mute. When I was talking, I was on mute.
Okay.
But you're good. I'm not going to keep going.
Yeah. I'm getting some freezing on your end. Am I coming through okay?
Yeah, you're good. I'll work on that.
Okay.
Since my power went out, I'm trying to adjust to using my phone. But you're good to keep going.
Okay. Now, the second reason that's sometimes given for being an atheist, a naturalist, is the problem of evil. that evil counts against the existence of God. Well, here, philosophers have largely given up what's called the logical form of the problem of evil, which is to say evil is logically inconsistent with God. And they've adopted the evidential form of the problem of evil, which says, well, the amount and type of evil in the world doesn't absolutely disprove the existence of God, but counts strongly against it. Now, so it makes it improbable. Now here, what I would comment is that what is probable on one body of evidence may not be probable on another body of evidence. So if we have a lot of evidence for what seems like supernatural causation, this would compensate or overbalance, say, the evidence from evil. So if we never had any evidence of what looks like supernatural causation in the world, the amount of evil could be taken as counting very strongly against the existence of God, because we don't have positive evidence in the form of, say, miracles, or needing supernatural explanation for certain other things, say the origin of life. But if, on the other hand, there's a lot of evidence for things like miracles or needing God to explain certain events, such as the origin and development of life, then this needs to be put against the evidence from evil. Now, the problem, again, with adopting methodological naturalism is it doesn't allow you to see or admit that positive body of evidence, even if it exists. So a metaphysical naturalist shouldn't be a methodological naturalist, because they should be open to the possible evidence against their position. But if they adopt methodological naturalism, that prevents them from being open to any evidence against their position.
Okay, so this is helpful. And if I'm tracking with you right, we're thinking like, okay, let's say someone's like a metaphysical naturalist, like they believe God doesn't exist and we just have the natural world. One of the main justifications that people will use is the problem of evil. Like, if God exists, like, why is there so much suffering? And you can point to all different kinds of like degrees and kinds of the suffering. And what you're saying here, Robert, is that when we're thinking about this carefully, we have to realize that, like, if you're going to make that kind of argument, that's not something that just comes from like methodological naturalism. Like, you're not just using like the tools of science. You're using this idea of like evil and whatnot. So you can't really like be a methodological naturalist and like bring up the problem of evil. Is that what's going on here?
Well, what I'm saying is, say we accept that evil counts against the existence of God. It doesn't disprove God, but it's evidence against God. How strong is that evidence? Well, if we don't have much positive evidence for God, then if we've got this negative evidence, it would count strongly against belief in God. Still with me? Now, if on the other hand, we have all sorts of positive evidence for God, then when we look at evil and we say, okay, that we can't really explain, that seems to be evidence against God, we're in a position to say, but we have all this positive evidence for God that outweighs the evidence from evil against God. Now, miracles would be evidence for God, or events best explained as miracles would be evidence for God. But if we adopt methodological naturalism, we're never in a position to recognize an event as a miracle. So what happens is that the positive evidence for theism, if you're a methodological naturalism, is curtailed. So it's the philosophical naturalist, the metaphysical naturalist, has stopped himself or herself from looking at any positive evidence for God that would outweigh the reasons that he or she gives for not believing in God. So, for example, the first claim was, well, there's no evidence for God. Well, if you adopt a method that doesn't allow you to recognize evidence for God, that's cheating. The second was, well, evil is evidence against God. Okay, suppose we say that as a theist. Suppose I say, prima facie, on the face of it, it's hard to say how God could allow evil. But we can't say, well, evil logically disproves God. That's been given up by philosophers. So if we say, well, evil is evidence against God, how seriously should we take that evidence will depend on whether there's good positive evidence for God. Now, again, if you adopt methodological naturalism, you're ruling out the possibility of recognizing positive evidence for God in the form of, say, miracles or the need to explain things in terms of supernatural causes.
Okay, that's helpful. Anything else you want to say, Robert, on this before we look at like some problems for theists who might be methodological naturalists?
Well, one thing I would say, and this is in the article that led you to talk to me, some people want to say, well, couldn't we just apply methodological naturalism provincially? Couldn't we just apply it in some scientific disciplines and not others? I don't think that's going to work very well. For example, psychologists want to be viewed as scientists. If somebody says, well, we shouldn't apply methodological naturalism in psychology, and I say, why? And they say, well, because the human isn't a purely physical being. The point is that science tends to say that it can explain anything that happens in the world. And it's going to be difficult to give a non-arbitrary reason that doesn't involve some kind of metaphysical commitment to say, well, I'm going to use it over here, but I'm not going to use it over here. But we could go on to the other point, another criticism I gave.
Okay, yeah, let's do it. So the question then here, sorry, I was like, are you going to talk or I'm going to talk? But I'll go. Is like one thing you talk about is like there's a problem for theists who are methodological naturalists. What's this problem, Robert?
Well, the problem is if you're a methodological naturalist, you're going to be tempted to say that God always achieves his purposes through the instrumentality of secondary causes. Okay, I mentioned the tides before. So we might say, well, God causes the tides, but God causes the tides by creating bodies that by creating bodies that have the power to attract one another, gravity. Okay, so God creates the earth. Sorry, God creates the material world. We have coming about out of the properties that things have, the formation of, say, planets, the formation of the earth and the moon. The nature of the moon having mass and the nature of the earth having mass is that there's gravitational attraction. And the gravitational attraction of the moon acts on the fluid on earth, the water. So we think of God as creating the tides indirectly through the properties of the things that he created and upholds, secondary causes. And it's clear that God does work through the instrumentality of secondary causes. As a theist, I don't think everything that happens in the world is a miracle. Okay. However, as a Christian theist, I think there are some events that happen that cannot be simply explained in terms of the properties of secondary causes. So throughout history, we have certain events that people took as signs and wonders, as miracles. And they took these things because they're so wonderful, they're so so out of the normal or natural that they took it to be a sign of what God wanted to impart. So take the Old Testament story of Elijah's contest with the prophets of Baal. You have the worship of Jehovah being undermined, and you have Elijah calling together these prophets of Baal, false god. You have Elijah saying, okay, we're going to have a contest. Who calls down fire from heaven? That's the indication of who has the correct understanding of the divine. And the story goes that the false priests of Baal, or the priests of Baal, they do all they can, but they can't call down fire from heaven. Elijah says, okay, I'm going to call down fire from heaven and burn up this sacrifice. Or take perhaps another example, the narrative in the New Testament of Jesus multiplying loaves and fishes. In our experience, loaves don't just multiply. Fish don't just multiply. So this seems to be an event that would not occur if nature were just left to itself. And that's what we mean by a miracle. People don't come back from the dead after 3 days being dead if nature is just left to itself. Okay? So the problem with adopting methodological naturalism is you've adopted a method which says, well, whenever you come across an event, you must give it a natural explanation. Well, if you're a methodological naturalist and you come across the multiplication of the loaves and fishes, if you think that actually happened, or you think that Jesus actually was back to life after 3 days, what you have to say is somehow that was just implicit in the order of nature. Now, traditionally, historically, theists have said God not only acts indirectly through natural causes, but also on occasion acts directly. The other thing that can happen is, suppose somebody says, well, I'm going to be a methodological naturalist as a scientist when I'm wearing my scientific hat, but when I'm wearing my religious hat, I'm going to talk of miracles. It seems to me that that would involve you in something of a schizophrenic attitude. So if I'm a scientist looking at the Jesus coming back to life after 3 days, I say, well, there must be a natural explanation. But if I'm a Christian scientist, I have to say as a Christian, well, that was also a miracle. How is this going to work? Now, what I'm suggesting is that really people who are scientists, whether they be a theist or a non-theist, they shouldn't be a methodological naturalist. If you're looking for truth, then presumably you should be open to the possibility that sometimes events don't have a natural cause.
Yeah, it seems like in your view, Robert, like what I've been understanding you as like you've been going through this interview is like we're thinking like when we're doing like the project of science or the project of history, we shouldn't, before we do our investigation, just narrow down to like a certain subset of causes. We should really keep our minds open with regards to all the possible views. And I think you could do that and still say like, hey, even like with scientific questions, like let's not be methodological naturalists, but hey, let's put like weight towards naturalism here and let's go from there. And if there's not a good explanation, well, let's think about it even further and see if it looks like there'd be like agency or things like that. So I think it's kind of a good approach.
Yeah. Now, sometimes people will say, well, if you reject methodological naturalism, you're going to commit the fallacy of God of the gaps. Now here, if people want to look a little deeper after our talk, there is an article I wrote a number of years ago, and I believe it's free on the internet, but it's called, Is There Anything Wrong with God of the Gaps Reasoning? So people might want to look at that if they want to go a little deeper after what I say here. The God of the Gaps is a version, or it's suggested it's a version of what's known as the fallacy of ignorance, argumentum ignorantium in the Latin. And that is to say, just because you haven't proven something is the case, you're not entitled to say, well, it's not the case. Or just because you haven't proven that something is not the case, you're not entitled to prove that it is the case. Let me give you an example that's often widely used. Suppose somebody says, well, nobody has ever proved that ghosts don't exist. And then they say, so that means that ghosts exist. That would simply be bad reasoning. Or suppose somebody says, well, you haven't proven that that mushroom is poisonous. You know, we're out in the woods on a walk, and I say to you, okay, let's pick that mushroom and have it for supper. And you say to me, well, maybe that mushroom is poisonous. And I say, well, we haven't proven that it's poisonous, therefore it's not poisonous. That would be really bad reasoning. So people often say, well, if you claim that God did something, that's simply an expression of ignorance. That's simply saying, well, because we haven't yet given a natural explanation, that doesn't mean that it doesn't have one. And then they go back to what I mentioned as the inductive justification of methodological naturalism. They say, well, look, science has been so successful in giving natural explanations, we should hold out and say that there will be a natural explanation. Well, that would take us back to the earlier argument I made, that sometimes the progress of science undermines giving a natural explanation, makes it even less likely as we know more and more. So as we know more and more about the chemistry of wine, it makes it even less easy to explain how water could turn into wine by Jesus simply saying, let this happen. The other point that is made here is that events we call miracles, they occur within a wider teleological pattern. Very good on this topic is Stephen Meyer in his books on intelligent design, Signature in the Cell, and Darwin's Dilemma. But a point here concerning, say, miracle or the origin of life as another example would be that what we're explaining is not just simply an anomaly. Rather, it occurs within a pattern where agency is often evident. So, for example, if we're talking about the origin of life, when we look at the cell and what's in the cell, we find things that are basically machines. They have all the structures. They're highly sophisticated nano machines. In fact, you'll have scientists describing the cell as a factory. You'll have talk of a code, the genetic code, information in the code. You'll have proteins described as machines. Well, the structures that we're observing, those are structures that we typically see as being produced by intelligent agency. So it's not simply, well, here is something that we just can't explain. It's that here is something that we routinely explain in terms of intelligent agency. Now, when we come to the question of miracles, and again, distinguish the question of whether an event occurred from its best explanation, okay? When we talk about a miracle, we've got two questions. One, did the event occur? And two, is it a miracle? Because to call an event a miracle is to talk about its cause, okay? It's not simply to say, here's an event. It's to say, here is what caused the event. So when we talk about the resurrection of Jesus, we don't simply say, Jesus is back from the dead. Wow. we say the resurrection of Jesus was produced by God, by divine intervention. Okay? So if we were to take as an example, say, the account of the virgin birth, this young woman, Mary, doesn't simply find herself inexplicably pregnant. Like, she doesn't say, oh, okay, here I am. I'm 4 months pregnant and I have no idea how this happened. I haven't had sex. I have no idea. It's just there. Well, notice that the account isn't that. It's not only that Mary is pregnant. It's that Mary is told by God that she will be pregnant, and what will be the reason for her being pregnant. Joseph has a very natural, if I can use that word, reaction to Mary's pregnancy. What does Joseph want to do when he finds out that Mary's pregnant? Well, being a good guy, he says, I'm going to quietly break this engagement. I know that people don't normally get pregnant without sex. I know that I haven't had sex with Mary. She must have been unfaithful. So what changes Joseph's mind? His dreams. So surrounding that event of Mary, a virgin, finding herself pregnant, is a whole teleological pattern. Or let me give another example. Paul on the Damascus Road. Paul is struck down. He has this experience. He's told to go into Damascus. He's struck blind. Okay. What happens at the same time is that a man, Ananias, is praying, and Ananias is told by God, go lay your hands on Saul to relieve him of the blindness, and I'm going to tell Paul, that he's going to be my spokesperson and how much he must suffer. What's Ananias's reaction is he says, are you sure? Because this guy is coming to persecute us. Okay, but you have, as it were, this whole pattern of not only is Saul struck blind, he's healed by a man who, in prayer, is given a message from God to give to Saul. Or if you think about Peter and Cornelius, Peter has this vision of a sheep being let down with animals in there that he's told to kill and eat. And he says, no, but those are unclean. The same time, Cornelius, a Gentile, is told, send in people to get Peter. And what you have is the whole understanding of the Jews who felt that God was simply for the Jewish people and not for the Gentiles. You have Peter being taken out of his mindset of this is only for the Jews, and Cornelius, the gospel is going to the Gentiles. So you have this pattern. It's not just, oh, we've got this strange event that we can't understand. It's that we have this wondrous event that expresses what God wants done in the world. I've carried on a long time on that, but I hope it makes some kind of sense.
Yeah, I think that does make sense. And I think it's helpful that we can just say that when we're looking at thinking about miracles, you brought up a good job. You did a really good job of bringing up how the context matters. If you look at things like the resurrection or Paul's conversion, these are things with a lot of religious context surrounding them that can help us to understand that they are miracles and what's going on there.
Yeah, and that gives us a guide. One thing I'm wondering though. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, you're good. Well, I guess what I was gonna say is the one thing I wondered is what about people claim miracles are happening today with healings or things like that? Is there less of a religious context now, or how does that fit into the picture?
Well, just before I go there, I want to give one other example. I was in a thunderstorm one time at my home, and I was lying in bed and there was all this very loud thunder, lightning very close. And I heard my mother in the night say, "Oh, what's that?" And in the morning, I asked her about what I'd heard. And she told me that a ball of blue light had floated in a window, hovered over her bed for a short time, and then floated out the other window. Now, there's a pretty amazing, unusual event, but I did not have the slightest inclination to take it as a miracle because there's no surrounding context that would make it, reasonable to view it as God somehow sending me a message or sending my mother a message. Okay. Now, you mentioned miracles happening today. I think very often there's a context. We've also been, I'm not a cessationalist, I'm not a dispensationalist. I do take seriously that miracles continue to happen. A very good book here that I will recommend is Craig Keener's 2-volume book on miracles. And he has more recently a shorter book, Miracles Today. If somebody wants to look at yet another book on miracle, I could recommend my own book, philosophical book, The Legitimacy of Miracle. In it, I give an appendix in which I discuss and chronicle some cases that I've come across. So, for example, we take it as part of God's nature that he's merciful. So when, say, when prayer occurs and people are healed dramatically, there does seem to be a context there that would make it appropriate to view it as something that God would do.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, that's really helpful, Robert. Here's something I'm wondering, like maybe like getting towards like the scientific examples. Some people might say that like not accepting methodological naturalism is like a science stopper. Like we're looking at the origin of life, and it's okay. Like let's just stop the science. Forget about what's going to happen in the next 100 years. You're just trying to like pull the brakes on like origin of life research. Or you could give examples of some people would say like evolutionary theory or cosmology. Like when we don't accept methodological naturalism, we're really pulling the brakes on science and stopping it. How would you respond to this kind of objection?
I think that's a very common and a very bad objection. As I say, it's very, very common. First, people who say want to give a naturalistic explanation of the origin of life, they can keep going. Say somebody is an atheist and they say, well, look, suppose I accept that Jesus came to life after 3 days being dead. Suppose I have to accept that event, but I don't want to call it a miracle. I want to give a natural explanation. And I'm going to say, go for it. Mm-hmm. Just do not tell me that you have that explanation and explain to me why you think that you will get it. Because as I say, the induction goes the other way. The more we know about human physiology, the harder it is to give that explanation. The more we know about the cell, the harder it is to talk about how we could get that without design. But nothing in what I've said says that people who want to pursue the possibility of a natural explanation can't go ahead and try and do it. In fact, what I'm suggesting is let hypothesis flourish. Put design on the table for the origin of life. And of course, if somebody can give a natural explanation that is plausible, then Occam's razor will get rid of the supernatural explanation. Mm-hmm. So I'm happy to let people with a different view try and give a different explanation. Okay, mm-hmm. So that's the first point. It doesn't stop science at all. Second, explanations do stop somewhere. Now, in principle, we say that all scientific explanations are in principle revisable. Sure, in principle. But take, for example, the scientific claim that your heart pumps the blood or that the blood circulates in your body. How easy is it going to be to overthrow that? I mean, in practice, we say, look, we have an explanation of why the blood circulates in the body. It's that the heart pumps it. Now, there may be all sorts of technical details to put around that we get to know more and more. But what would it take to say we're wrong in our claim that the heart pumps the blood? That the explanation of the blood circulating is the heart pumping it. So in principle, yeah, you could say we could be mistaken, but it's very hard to think that we in actuality could be mistaken. So explanations do tend to end somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
If it's a good explanation, we're justified in accepting it. And we're justified in accepting it until we have reasons not to accept it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What I really like about what you're saying here, Robert, is that like by rejecting methodological naturalism, like this isn't undercutting science. This isn't like anything like that. It's just saying like, hey, we need to have like non-naturalist explanations on the table. It doesn't mean that like, oh, like God has to be the most likely explanation for every unknown question. It's just like, hey, we should just at least consider these things when we're thinking about this, and let's keep researching and keep going. But let's just like at least have the option on the table that maybe there isn't all just like a naturalist kind of framework.
Yeah, just let there be a place at the table. And in principle, suppose it's very difficult to define science. Like if you ask people for a definition of science, it's very difficult to get a clear-cut definition. But suppose we say that science is the search for natural causes, a disciplined search for natural causes. Suppose we were to say that. Well, there's no guarantee that in a disciplined search for natural causes, we're always going to find natural causes. So, for example, if we take Big Bang Theory, the beginning of the universe, our best science seems to suggest that the universe had an absolute beginning. So we went as far back as we could in tracing natural causes, and we came to something that we can't give a natural cause for. Okay? Now, arguably, science has done that in the case of the origin of the universe. Why would it not be possible for us to come to the same conclusion concerning the origin of life? I'm not saying that we have, but I'm saying maybe when we conduct a disciplined search for natural causes and we give it our best shot, our best effort, we devote all sorts of resources to it, maybe sometimes we will come to the conclusion that for certain events, we cannot explain them completely in terms of natural causes. Arguably, we've done that in the case of the origin of the universe. It may be that we have to come to that conclusion regarding, say, the origin and development, the origin of life, or certain developments in life's history. It may be that we, in investigating certain events, say certain healings, that we would come to the conclusion, no, there's not a natural cause there. Now, indeed, I distinguished between two questions earlier. One, did the event occur? And two, what's its explanation? In the case of life, we can't deny that life is there. So our tendency has been to deny that it needs a supernatural explanation. In the case of miracles, many people want to say, well, they would be so hard to explain naturalistically that we don't think they actually happened.
Mm-hmm.
That begs the question. The question of whether an event occurred is a different question from what's its best explanation. And the criteria for answering those are different. So let me give you a example that is a bit of a warning. At one time, meteorites, the famous French astronomer Laplace would not accept testimony to the fact of stones sometimes falling out of the sky. He said it's only ignorant peasants that report that. And he rejected that on the basis that there was no room in his scientific theory for such events happening.
Mhm.
So we need to be careful when people report, say, things that look like miracles, that we don't say, or that the atheist doesn't say, if they're going to be fair, well, there's no room in my theory for that. I can't explain that naturalistically, so it couldn't have happened. Rather, we should ask, did it really happen? And then ask, and is our theory adequate to its explanation? So we shouldn't let theory trump evidence. We should allow ourselves to go where the evidence takes us. And that's a reason why I don't like methodological naturalism. It doesn't allow us to go where the evidence takes us.
Okay, that's very helpful, Robert. One more like objection here is like the question of like, what about a view of something like a liberal naturalism? Maybe people are like, hey, like this consciousness problem, this hard problem of consciousness is pretty hard. Maybe consciousness is just non-physical, but we can still be naturalists. And you could say the same thing about maybe moral truths or like maybe even like teleological like structure, but in like a naturalist framework. Can these make sense of like in like salvage methodological naturalism? What are your thoughts here, Robert?
Yeah, there's something called liberal naturalism, and some people are attracted to liberal naturalism because typically naturalism exacts a very high price. So, for example, a very, very good philosopher of mind, Yagwon Kim, who was a metaphysical naturalist, he made a very strong case that if you're a metaphysical naturalist, mental states don't have any causal efficacy. So what he meant by that is they don't cause anything. Whatever happens was not caused by your mental state. So if you react to what you think is an insult, it wasn't because your mental state was, I was insulted. It was something else going on. So you have people who are naturalists talking about the hard problem of consciousness. You have people who are struggling with the science around the origin of life. You have naturalists who are saying, well, if naturalism is the case, it's very difficult to get objective morality. So liberal naturalists, they want to say, well, look, can't we get mental states as having causal power? Can't we talk about genuine human agency? Can't we talk about moral norms? Well, two comments I'd make here. One, it's not evident that you can get that out of naturalism. So you have people who are saying, I don't like those results of naturalism. I want to be a naturalism without those. But then you have to ask, are they being consistent in their naturalism? Second, if one wants to be a liberal naturalist, setting that aside, even if you could get it, it would seem strange if they allow that we can allow the legitimacy explaining certain events in terms of a conscious agent purposefully exerting causal influence in the world. So if the liberal naturalist says, okay, people actually, by making choices, by exercising their intelligence, bring about things in the world, and we can recognize when they do, it'd be very strange then to rule out saying, well, we could recognize supernatural agency bringing about certain events in the world. So once you admit agency into explanation, and it's not clear how methodological naturalism could do that, but once you do that, it's going to be arbitrary to rule out non-human intelligent agency in the world.
Okay, so that's helpful, Robert. One thing I want to do before we wrap up is like talk about the importance of like tolerance in this discussion. It seems like to me like we've done one of the big points to bring home here is that like we just need to have like tolerance of other views. Help us and just like kind of like look at like what's the best explanation and just like have a pretty open mind about what those explanations could be. So, in your view, Robert, like why is tolerance such an important part of this discussion?
There's always a tendency for us to indulge in name calling and ad hominem arguments. Ad hominem argument is when you don't deal with a person's argument, rather you dismiss them on the basis of their personality or you don't like them. A very bad example here is Dave Farina. He's been very critical of James Tour and Farina. There was a debate between him and James Tour, a lot of name calling by Farina. When you call names and when you say, well, I can dismiss your argument because I don't like your personality, that's not really effective in a genuine search for truth. So if I'm to be open to the possibility of being mistaken, if my opponent is open to the possibility of being mistaken, then we have to treat each other fairly, and we have to exhibit what is known as the principle of charity. That is to say, when I interpret somebody, I put the best reading on what they say that what they said actually allows. So a genuine search for truth requires open and fair discussion of differing points of view. And, it can be a lot of fun just to dismiss somebody on, well, they're just a crazy Christian, or they're just a stupid atheist, or, because I was brought up a certain way, I have to think a certain way. Well, that really doesn't deal with the arguments. And sometimes, maybe not all that often as we would wish, but sometimes people are actually persuaded by argument. So sometimes people change their mind and come over to another position on the basis of being given good reasons. And we can't, and here I'm speaking as a Christian, if I'm hoping to show that somebody is wrong, well, it's fair enough to criticize their argument, but I can't do so in a way that's hateful to them as a person. Yeah.
So one thing I'm thinking about here, Robert, is as we wrap up, is there any last thoughts or things you want to say before we close up shop here today?
What I would say is go out and look. Actually read some people on both sides. So, for example, if you're looking at intelligent design arguments, actually do some reading. Don't simply look at what the critics say about it. Similarly, if I'm on the other side, actually take seriously some of the criticisms. There's a nice story about one of the people who's at Discovery Institute, Gunter Beckley. He was actually in charge of a museum, and they were doing an exhibit for Darwin. And they were going to do the exhibit with a visual aids where they had a balance, and they were going to show all the books and materials and articles that have been written in support of the Darwinian theory of evolution. And on the other side, they were going to show the much smaller number of books that were on, say, intelligent design. And he, as a matter of intellectual integrity, thought that, well, if I'm going to do this, I should actually read some of the intelligent design material. And when he did that, he actually came over to the intelligent design position. He was persuaded by the arguments. Now, maybe he was wrong in his persuasion. That could be argued. Who knows? But the point is that he actually looked at the arguments of the other side and found that those arguments weren't bad arguments. So, if Christianity is true, then ultimately we can't be afraid of truth. But we need to not be superficial in our investigation. So some areas you're best to stay out of unless you're going to look at them in depth. But if you are worried about something, then look at it in depth and have the trust that truth will out.
Yeah, all for truth, for sure. Robert, thank you so much for coming on today. I really appreciate your time and just everything you laid out today. I feel like this is super informative, and there's so much for me to learn and think about through this. And thank you for sticking through all my technical difficulties. Never had the power go out in the middle of a podcast before, but I mean, we got through it today. So thank you. And how can people follow you, connect with you, things like that?
I do have a website. I think if you type in robertlarmer.com, that there's a website there. It isn't quite as full as I hope to get it, but there are some of my articles there, and I occasionally blog there. My email is rlarmer@unb.ca. You have that, Zach, so you can feel free if there are people that want to contact me to pass that on. And if you do a Google search on Robert Larmer, I imagine that you'll find writings that I've done, and you can look at those further. But yeah, I don't have oodles and oodles of time, but if people have questions that they want to ask, I'm happy to be contacted, and I'll do my best either to answer them or give you a good resource or a good person to whom to talk.
Well, I'd love that, and I encourage people, if you're listening, I know we have a pretty decent sized skeptic audience that listens to this a lot. Feel free to leave a comment, but also we have an amazing philosopher here offering to answer your questions. So feel free to email him. I'll leave a contact link to him in the description in some way, shape, or form. But yeah, thank you so much for coming on today, Robert. I really appreciate your time. Thank you to everyone who listened today. This is here in Apologetics. If you value what we do, be sure to subscribe and leave a like. And if you wanted to support more, you can become a patron at patreon.com/Apologetics. We have a goal of just getting one new patron a month, and you can do that for as little as just $1 a month. And that'd be huge if you could support the show out a little bit. But Robert, one last time, thank you so much for coming on today. I really appreciate your time.
Well, thank you for having me, and I hope that at least some of this made some sense to you.
I think it made a lot of sense. So
Okay.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for listening. Have a good one, and God bless.
Yeah, take care.